Welcome back, dear friends. Before we begin, let me know where in the world you are watching, and please don't forget to subscribe and like to support the channel. Close your eyes for a moment. In this precise instant, who are you? Not the name your parents gave you, not the job title on your business card, not the accumulation of your past or the projection of your future, but right now, this very second, what is the consciousness experiencing these words? Where does it reside? How did it come to be? And perhaps most mysteriously of all, will it be the same consciousness when you wake tomorrow morning? This question, deceptively simple yet infinitely complex, haunted one man so deeply that his answer would reshape the foundations of civilization itself. His name was John Locke, and tonight, as you settle into the quietness of approaching sleep, we will walk together through the cathedral of thought he constructed, stone by philosophical stone, until we discover something extraordinary. We will find that the questions he asked about consciousness, about identity, about freedom and knowledge are not merely academic puzzles gathering dust in forgotten books. They are the very questions that pulse beneath every moment of your waking life, and perhaps, as we shall see, even your sleeping one. Picture England in the year 1632. A world balanced on a knife's edge between the old certainties and a dawning age that would question everything. In a small village called Rington in Somerset, a child enters the world who will grow to challenge not just the political order of kingdoms, but the understanding of what it means to be human. This child, John Locke, would become many things in his lifetime. A physician who studied the workings of the human body, a political revolutionary whose ideas were so dangerous he would be forced to flee his homeland, living under an assumed name in foreign exile, an advisor to the powerful who helped shape the course of governments, and above all, a philosopher who asked questions so fundamental that we are still, more than 3 centuries after his death, attempting to answer them. But here is what makes tonight's journey so remarkable. Locke's great insights did not emerge from pure abstraction or ivory tower speculation. They grew from careful observation, from watching patients as a physician and noting how the mind emerged from the fog of fever, from experiencing firsthand the tyranny of absolute power and wondering what made any government legitimate, from studying his own consciousness as it woke each morning and asking what connected yesterday's self to today's, from noticing how children learned and questioning whether we truly arrive in this world with knowledge already inscribed upon our souls. The world into which John Locke was born believed it knew the answers to fundamental questions with absolute certainty. The king ruled by divine right, ordained by God himself, and to question this was to question the very architecture of creation. Knowledge was something innate, planted in the soul before birth, waiting only to be remembered. Your station in life, whether peasant or prince, was determined by providence and immutable law. The structure of reality itself seemed fixed, hierarchical, and ultimately beyond human power to alter. And yet, something was stirring. The year before Locke's birth, Galileo had faced the Inquisition for suggesting the Earth moved around the sun. When Locke was a boy, England descended into a brutal civil war that would see a king beheaded and the entire social order thrown into chaos. His father, a country lawyer, fought in the parliamentary army against royal absolutism. Young John grew up in a house where the divine right of kings was not an unquestionable truth, but a dangerous lie. He witnessed firsthand how certainty could become tyranny, how unquestioned authority could lead to bloodshed in the streets. These experiences planted seeds in fertile soil. As Locke pursued his education at Oxford, studying first philosophy and then medicine, he encountered the emerging scientific method. He befriended the great chemist, Robert Boyle, who taught him to trust observation over ancient texts. He studied the human body with Thomas Sydenham, learning to watch patients carefully rather than impose theoretical systems upon them. He absorbed the revolutionary mathematics of Isaac Newton, who would become a close friend, and slowly, a radical idea began to crystallize in his mind. What if everything we had been taught about human nature was fundamentally wrong? What if we did not arrive in this world with our knowledge, our identities, our social roles already determined? What if the mind at birth was not a repository of innate truths, but something else entirely? Something that would make the structure of society, the legitimacy of government, the very nature of the self, far more fluid and far more interesting than anyone had imagined. This idea was not merely philosophically novel, it was politically explosive. Because if Locke was right, if human beings were not born with predetermined natures and divinely ordained stations, then the entire edifice of absolute monarchy, inherited privilege, and rigid social hierarchy rested on nothing more substantial than old habits and brute force. Kings did not rule because God made them superior beings. Nobles were not naturally fitted to command peasants. Knowledge was not the exclusive province of the learned elite who claimed to possess truths ordinary people could never grasp. The implications were breathtaking and terrifying, and they would eventually force Locke into exile. Suspected of treason, living under the constant threat of assassination, his books published anonymously lest they trace back to him. But tonight, as you rest, we are safe to explore these dangerous ideas together. We can follow Locke's reasoning wherever it leads, watching as a new understanding of human consciousness, identity, and freedom emerges from his careful observations and bold conclusions. So let us begin where Locke himself began, with a question so fundamental that everything else would flow from its answer, a question about the origin of ideas, the nature of knowledge, and the contents of the human mind. But I must warn you gently. Once you truly understand Locke's answer, once you see what he saw, you may never look at yourself or the world around you quite the same way again. The familiar will become strange, the certain will become questionable, and the self you thought you knew so intimately will reveal itself as something far more mysterious and magnificent than you ever imagined. The question, put simply, is this: when you think a thought, where did that thought come from? In Locke's time, the prevailing answer seemed obvious to learned scholars. Knowledge, they insisted, was innate. The human mind contained certain fundamental truths from birth, placed there either by God or by the essential nature of the rational soul itself. Principles like the law of non-contradiction, the axioms of mathematics, the existence of God, basic moral truths about right and wrong, all of these were supposedly stamped upon the mind before we ever opened our eyes to behold the world. This doctrine of innate ideas had ancient roots. Plato had taught that learning was really remembering, that the soul possessed knowledge from before its embodiment, and that education merely awakened these dormant truths. The medieval scholastics had integrated this with Christian theology, and in Locke's own century, the great French philosopher René Descartes had argued that certain clear and distinct ideas, the cogito itself, the existence of God, the principles of geometry, were known with absolute certainty precisely because they were innate to rational minds. It was an elegant theory. It explained how we could have knowledge that seemed universal, transcending the accidents of individual experience. It grounded morality in something deeper than mere convention. And it supported a hierarchical view of society. Some souls possess these innate truths more clearly than others, the philosopher more than the peasant, the civilized European more than the savage, the man more than the woman. But John Locke, watching carefully, observing newborn infants, studying people of different cultures, examining his own consciousness, with merciless honesty, became convinced this elegant theory was entirely wrong. Consider a newborn child, he suggested. Observe this tiny being with clear eyes, without preconception. Do you see a mind stocked with innate knowledge? Do you see a creature contemplating the law of non-contradiction or the existence of God? Or do you see something else entirely? A mind that seems almost perfectly receptive, open, unformed, responding to sensations, beginning to organize the raw data of experience into something coherent, but starting, it would appear, from nothing. Locke pressed the point. If there truly were innate ideas, propositions that all minds possessed from birth, then we should find universal agreement on these principles. But where is this agreement? Travel the world, he observed, and you will find tremendous diversity in beliefs about God, about morality, about the fundamental nature of reality. Some peoples worship one God, others many, still others none at all. Moral codes vary dramatically. Even seemingly obvious logical principles are not grasped by children or those without education. The defenders of innate ideas had a response. These truths are innate, they said, but they require reason to uncover them, maturity to recognize them. They are like seeds planted in the soul, waiting for the right conditions to bloom. Locke found this answer unsatisfying. If reason is required to discover these supposedly innate ideas, then how are they different from ideas we learn through experience and reasoning? The word innate becomes meaningless. It is like saying hunger is innate, even though a person feels no hunger. Saying the mind possesses knowledge that it does not actually know is a contradiction in terms. And then Locke posed a question that cuts to the heart of the matter. If the soul has innate ideas that it acquired before embodiment, or that are simply part of its essence, why do these ideas never appear in consciousness in their pure original form? Why, when we sleep, do we not dream of these pristine innate truths? Why does the soul, in its supposed retreat during sleep, never light upon these ideas it possessed before experience touched it? Instead, even our most abstract thoughts, even our strangest dreams, seem to be recombinations of things we have encountered in waking life. The tang of the cask, as Locke beautifully put it, marks even our most sublime conceptions. So if knowledge is not innate, where does it come from? Locke's answer was revolutionary in its simplicity and profound in its implications. Let us suppose, he wrote, that the mind at birth is like white paper, void of all characters, without any ideas. How then does it come to be furnished? From where does it acquire that vast store of ideas, which the busy and boundless imagination of human beings has painted upon it? The answer: experience. Nothing more and nothing less. Every idea that ever passed through a human mind, every thought you have ever entertained, every concept you grasp, every fleeting image and every abstract principle, all of it, ultimately, traces back to experience. The mind is not like a container filled before birth with treasures. It is like a blank slate, a tabula rasa, as later interpreters would call it, though Locke himself used the metaphor of white paper or an empty cabinet. But what did Locke mean by experience? Here his answer becomes rich and nuanced, revealing the careful observer behind the bold theory. Experience, he explained, comes to us through two channels, two fountains that supply all the materials of knowledge. The first is sensation. This is the most obvious channel. Through our five senses, seeing, hearing, touching, tasting, smelling, the external world impresses itself upon consciousness. A shaft of sunlight falling across a room, the sound of rain on a window, the taste of honey, the scent of roses, the warmth of another person's hand. These are simple ideas, the basic building blocks of thought, delivered directly by the senses. They are particular, immediate, undeniable. The redness of this rose, the coldness of that ice, the brightness of yonder star. As you lie here now, preparing for sleep, notice the sensations arriving at the shores of your consciousness. Perhaps the softness of your pillow against your cheek, the weight of blankets upon your body, the quality of light or darkness in the room. These simple sensory impressions are, according to Locke, the foundational elements from which all your knowledge of the external world is constructed. But Locke recognized something crucial that makes his empiricism sophisticated rather than simplistic. There is a second channel of experience, one that comes not from the external world, but from within. He called it reflection. This is the mind's perception of its own operations, the awareness of thinking itself, the recognition of doubting, believing, reasoning, willing, imagining, remembering. These two are experiences, internal experiences, and they give rise to another whole class of ideas. When you are aware that you are thinking about something, that is reflection. When you notice yourself doubting or believing, desiring or fearing, remembering yesterday or imagining tomorrow, these operations of the mind itself become objects of experience. And just as sensation gives us ideas of colours, sounds and textures, reflection gives us ideas of thought, doubt, belief and will. This distinction is elegant and important. Locke is not claiming that the mind is purely passive, merely receiving impressions like wax receiving a seal. The mind has active powers. It compares, it combines, it abstracts, it remembers. But, and this is crucial, the materials upon which these powers operate must ultimately come from sensation or reflection. The mind cannot create simple ideas out of nothing. It can only work with what experience provides. Consider the idea of a golden mountain. You have never seen a golden mountain. Perhaps no such thing exists in the world, and yet you can conceive of one easily. How? By combining two simple ideas you have received through experience, the idea of gold, which you know from sensation, and the idea of a mountain, which you likewise know from sensation. The mind's power to combine is remarkable, but the ingredients must come from experience, or consider something more abstract, like the idea of infinity. How does a finite mind conceive of the infinite? Locke's answer: by taking the idea of finite, magnitude which we know from experience, and the idea of addition, which we also know from experience, and then applying the operation of addition without end. We can imagine always adding one more. The idea of infinity is thus constructed by the mind operating on materials given in experience. Now, you might be wondering, what about necessary truths? What about mathematics? Surely 2 + 2 = 4, not because of experience, but because of some innate rational insight. Locke's answer is subtle. The ideas of 2 and 4 are indeed built up from experience, from counting actual objects. But once we have these ideas, we can perceive certain relationships between them that are necessarily true. That 2 + 2 = 4 is a relationship we perceive between our ideas. It is a kind of intuitive knowledge, where we see the connection immediately and certainly. But the ideas themselves still originated in experience. The implications of this seemingly simple theory ripple outward in extraordinary ways. If all ideas come from experience, then the mind you possess right now, with all its contents, its memories, its knowledge, its personality, is the cumulative result of every experience you have ever had. You were not born as you. You became you, written upon gradually by sensation and reflection, day by day, moment by moment, from your first blurry perceptions as an infant to this present instant. And this means something profound about human equality. A peasant and a prince begin with the same blank slate. The differences between them are not innate, not ordained by nature or God, but the result of vastly different experiences, different educations, different opportunities to fill the mind with ideas. Given the same experiences, the same education, there is no reason the peasant could not grasp everything the prince grasps. The hierarchy of souls dissolves under Locke's patient gaze. It also means something profound about human potential. If we are not locked into predetermined natures, if our minds are shaped by experience, then we can be shaped differently. Education becomes not the uncovering of innate truths, but the careful provision of the right experiences. Character becomes not fixed essence, but the result of habits formed through repeated experiences. Reform, improvement, growth, all of these become possible in a way they cannot be if our natures are innate and immutable, and it means something profound about knowledge itself. If all ideas trace back to experience, then knowledge is not the privilege of special souls who grasp innate truths more clearly than others. It is available, at least in principle, to anyone who can receive sensations and engage in reflection. The democratization of knowledge follows from the blank slate. But Locke was too honest an observer to pretend the slate remains blank for long. From our earliest moments, sensations pour in. The mind begins its work of organizing, comparing, remembering. Simple ideas combine into complex ones. Experiences accumulate into habits. Associations form between ideas. And gradually, mysteriously, something emerges that we call the self, which brings us to perhaps the deepest and most personal of all Locke's inquiries. Because once you accept that the mind begins as a blank slate and is furnished by experience, a profound question arises. If you are constantly changing, if new experiences are always being added, if the contents of your mind today are different from what they were yesterday and will be different tomorrow, then what makes you you? What is the principle of continuity that connects the infant you once were, the child you became, the adult you are now, and the older person you will someday be? This question of personal identity captivated Locke, and his answer to it may be his most profound and unsettling contribution to philosophy. But to understand his answer, we must first understand what he was arguing against. The traditional view, inherited from medieval philosophy and still dominant in Locke's time, held that personal identity consisted in the identity of substance. You are the same person over time because you are the same substance over time. For dualists like Descartes, this meant you were the same immaterial soul. For others, it might mean the same living organism. Either way, identity was a matter of being the same thing in a substantial sense. But Locke, with his characteristic empiricism, asked a troubling question. How do you know you are the same soul or substance over time? You have no direct experience of your own soul or substantial self. What you have experience of is consciousness. You are aware of your thoughts, your perceptions, your memories. But do you perceive some underlying substance beneath all of this? Locke suggested you do not, and indeed cannot. Consider dreamless sleep, that mysterious state you may soon enter. When you wake tomorrow morning, how will you know you are the same person who went to sleep tonight? Not because you perceive the same substance, whatever that would mean, but because you will remember going to sleep. Your consciousness tomorrow morning will encompass the memories of your consciousness tonight. This continuity of consciousness, Locke suggested, is what constitutes personal identity. He defined a person as a thinking, intelligent being that has reason and reflection and can consider itself as itself, the same thinking thing, in different times and places. And the key to this self-awareness across time is memory. Consciousness, he wrote, as far as it extends, makes the same person. To illustrate this radical idea, Locke proposed thought experiments that still provoke discussion 3 centuries later. Imagine, he suggested, that the soul of a prince, carrying all its memories and consciousness, were to enter the body of a cobbler, a humble shoemaker. Everyone looking at this person would see the cobbler's body. But suppose this body now contained all the memories, all the consciousness of the prince. Who would this person be? The prince or the cobbler? By the substance view, this person would be the cobbler, same body, perhaps same biological organism. But Locke insisted this person would actually be the prince, because personal identity follows consciousness, not substance. Wherever the prince's consciousness goes, there the prince is, regardless of what substance houses that consciousness. Now flip it around. Suppose the cobbler's soul entered the prince's body. Everyone at court would bow to the prince's body. But if this body now contained only the cobbler's memories and consciousness, this person would not be the prince. He would be the cobbler, despite appearances. These thought experiments seem fanciful, and Locke knew they were unlikely ever to occur, but they served a purpose. They clarified that when we care about personal identity, when we worry about whether someone will be held responsible for past actions or rewarded for past virtues, what matters is continuity of consciousness, not identity of substance. This becomes especially clear in cases of memory loss. Suppose a person commits a crime, but then suffers complete amnesia, genuinely losing all memory of the act, and indeed of their entire previous life. Are they still the same person who committed the crime? By the substance view, yes, same body or soul. But by Locke's consciousness view, no. This raises difficult questions about justice and responsibility. Questions Locke acknowledged but did not fully resolve. The implications are both comforting and unsettling. Comforting because they suggest personal identity is not a mysterious, metaphysical fact about substances you cannot perceive, but something grounded in the very experience of consciousness you know intimately. Your identity is constituted by your memories, your sense of continuity, your ability to recognize yourself across time, but unsettling because this makes identity more fragile than we might like. What happens if memories are lost? What happens in cases of divided consciousness, like split-brain patients modern neuroscience has discovered? What about false memories, where you remember something that never actually happened? If identity is constituted by consciousness and memory, then identity can be disrupted, fragmented, even multiplied in ways the substance view never allowed. Locke also made a subtle but important distinction between the identity of a man and the identity of a person. The identity of a man, meaning the human organism, might continue even if personal identity is interrupted. Someone in a permanent coma is still the same living human organism, the same man, but perhaps not the same person if consciousness is utterly gone. And conversely, personal identity might in principle continue even if the underlying substance changed, as in the prince and cobbler example. This distinction has profound implications for questions about the afterlife, a topic of great concern in Locke's religious age. Many of his contemporaries worried, how can there be resurrection of the body if the body decays and its matter disperses? Locke's answer offered a kind of reassurance. What matters for the resurrection is not that the exact same matter be reassembled, but that the same consciousness continue. God could, in principle, provide a new body for the same person, as long as consciousness persists. But the deepest implication of Locke's view is this: you are not a thing that has experiences. You are, in some sense, the experiences themselves, or rather, the unity and continuity of consciousness that binds experiences together into a coherent perspective on the world. This consciousness, this awareness that can say I and recognize itself across time, this is the self, and it is built, moment by moment, from the stream of sensations, reflections, and memories that constitute your lived experience. As you lie here, consciousness beginning to dim as sleep approaches, consider this. The person who wakes tomorrow, morning will be you, not because they occupy the same body, though they will, but because their consciousness will encompass tonight. They will remember lying here, listening to these words, feeling the weight of blankets, breathing in and out. The continuity of memory will bridge the gap of sleep, creating the narrative thread that constitutes your identity. But what about sleep itself? Here, Locke made an observation that troubled some of his readers, but follows logically from his view. During deep, dreamless sleep, where is consciousness? It is not present to itself. You are not aware of being asleep while you are in that state, so in what sense are you a person during dreamless sleep? Locke's answer, carefully worded, is that personal identity is interrupted during such times. The sleeping person is the same man, the same human organism, but perhaps not in the fullest sense the same person, since consciousness has ceased. This might seem troubling, but there is something rather beautiful about it. It means that sleep is a kind of small death, a genuine discontinuity in personal existence. And waking is a kind of resurrection, a renewal of the self. Every morning, consciousness returns, memory bridges the gap, and you become yourself again. The self is not a permanent, substantial thing, but an ongoing achievement, a continuity created by consciousness rather than a metaphysical given. And this brings us to Locke's political philosophy, because the same empiricist approach, the same careful observation of human nature, the same willingness to question received wisdom, led him to revolutionary conclusions about the legitimate basis of government, the nature of rights, and the proper relationship between individuals and authority. If Locke's epistemology erased the boundary between noble and common minds, his political philosophy erased the boundary between divine right and mere force. To understand the radical nature of Locke's political thought, we must first understand what he was arguing against. The political orthodoxy of his time, the view that legitimized absolute monarchy and made questioning royal authority tantamount to blasphemy, was the doctrine of the divine right of kings. This doctrine held that political authority descended from God through an unbroken chain. God had appointed Adam as sovereign over creation. This sovereignty passed to Adam's heirs, and through various genealogical paths descended to the monarchs of Locke's day. The king was God's lieutenant on earth, and obedience to the king was obedience to God. To resist the king was to resist the divine order itself. This was not a fringe view, but the official position of the English monarchy and the established church. A book titled Patriarcha, written by Robert Filmer, laid out this case systematically. Filmer argued that children are born into subjection to their fathers, and fathers hold absolute authority over their children. This paternal authority, originating with Adam, had been inherited by kings. Subjects were literally the children of their monarchs, owing the same absolute obedience children owe fathers. Against this towering edifice of divine right, inherited authority, and paternal power, John Locke proposed a simple, devastating question. Where is the evidence? How do we know, he asked, that political authority descends from Adam? Even if we grant that Adam had some kind of dominion over the earth, a large concession, how do we trace this authority through all the generations to any particular living monarch? The genealogies are lost in the mists of time. Multiple claimants could assert descent from Adam. The whole system collapses into arbitrary assertion backed by nothing more than force. But Locke did not stop with this historical argument. He made a more fundamental point. Even if we could trace unbroken descent from Adam, even if we knew with certainty who Adam's rightful heir was, this would not establish political obligation. Because paternal power is not, and never was, absolute. And even if it were, political authority is not the same as paternal authority. What, then, is the true basis of political obligation? What makes a government legitimate? What gives anyone the right to command another person to obey? Locke's answer began with a thought experiment, a device borrowed from earlier political philosophers, but deployed by Locke with devastating effect. Imagine, he wrote, human beings in a state of nature before any government exists. What would this condition be like? Here, Locke's answer differed dramatically from that of Thomas Hobbes, another English philosopher who had also used the state of nature as a conceptual tool. For Hobbes, writing during the chaos of civil war, the state of nature was a nightmare, a war of all against all, where life was solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Human beings in their natural condition, Hobbes thought, were so dangerous to one another that any government, even the most absolute and tyrannical, was preferable to the anarchy of nature. But Locke, observing human nature more optimistically, saw things differently. The state of nature, he argued, was not a state of war, but a state of perfect freedom and equality. In this natural condition, all persons are equal in the sense that no one has natural authority over anyone else. No one is born to command, no one born to obey. Each person has the right to order their own actions, dispose of their possessions, and live as they see fit, without asking permission from anyone. But, and this is crucial, the state of nature is not a state of license. Freedom does not mean you can do whatever you want. Even in the absence of human government, Locke argued, there is law, natural law, which binds all rational beings. What is this natural law? Locke defined it as the law of reason itself, discernible by any rational creature. And reason, if consulted, teaches certain fundamental principles. First among them, that all human beings, being equal and independent, ought to respect one another's rights to life, liberty, and estate. No one ought to harm another in these fundamental goods without cause. Or, as Locke memorably put it, no, one ought to harm another in their life, health, liberty, or possessions. Why? Because we are all the workmanship of God, made to last during His pleasure, not one another's. Our bodies and lives are not our own property to dispose of as we please. They belong to God who made us. Therefore, we have no right to destroy ourselves or others. But everything else, our actions, our labor, the fruits of our labor, these we do own, and these no one may take from us without our consent. This introduces Locke's famous labor theory of property, an idea that would influence economic thought for centuries. How does private property arise in the state of nature? Locke's answer: through the mixing of labor with natural resources. Imagine the earth in its original state, held, in common by all humanity. No one owns any particular part of it. The apples on trees, the water in streams, the land itself, all are common. But suppose you pick an apple. By the act of picking, by mixing your labor with this natural object, you make it yours. The apple becomes your property because you expended effort to acquire it, and your labor is undeniably your own. The same principle applies to land. If you clear a section of wilderness, plow the soil, plant crops, you have mixed your labor with the earth. This land becomes yours, at least provisionally. You have a property right to the fruits of your labor. But Locke added a crucial limitation, what philosophers now call the Lockean proviso. Your appropriation is legitimate only if you leave enough and as good for others. You cannot take all the water from a stream, leaving others to die of thirst. You cannot fence off all available land, leaving others with no place to work. Property rights are real and important, but they are not unlimited. They exist within the constraint that others must also have the opportunity to sustain themselves. This theory of property had implications both radical and conservative. Radical because it suggested that property rights come not from social convention or royal grant, but from the natural right to the fruits of one's labor. A peasant who works land has more legitimate claim to it than a king who merely inherited title. Conservative because it provided a firm foundation for private property against those who might claim all things should be held in common. But Locke's state of nature, for all its freedom and equality, had problems. He called them inconveniences. Without an established legal system, disputes arose over who owned what. Without impartial judges, people judged their own cases, inevitably with bias. Without reliable enforcement, the strong could violate the weak with impunity. The state of nature was not a war of all against all, but it was insecure, uncertain, uncomfortable. So rational people, Locke argued, would choose to leave the state of nature. They would come together and establish civil society through a social contract. But, and here is where Locke's theory becomes revolutionary, this contract is not a surrender of rights to an absolute sovereign. It is a conditional grant of limited powers to a government whose sole purpose is to better secure the very rights people possessed in the state of nature. Think about what this means. Government exists to protect life, liberty, and property. These rights precede government. They are natural rights, possessed by virtue of being human, not granted by any political authority. Government is therefore a tool, a mechanism, for securing rights more effectively, and it is legitimate only insofar as it serves this purpose. The authority of government comes from the consent of the governed. This is the heart of the social contract. By consenting, explicitly or tacitly, to be part of a civil society, people agree to abide by the decisions of the majority, to follow established laws, to submit disputes to impartial judges, rather than taking justice into their own hands. But this consent is conditional. It assumes the government will fulfill its purpose of protecting rights. And here, Locke made an argument that would echo through history. When a government systematically violates the rights it was established to protect, when it becomes destructive of the ends for which it was formed, the people have a right to alter or abolish it. The right of revolution is not a lawless abandonment of order, but the ultimate safeguard of natural rights against governmental tyranny. This was not abstract theorizing. Locke wrote his 2 treatises on government during the crisis that would lead to the overthrow of King James II in 1688, the event known as the Glorious Revolution. His arguments provided intellectual justification for resisting a monarch who had overstepped his legitimate authority, and they would be taken up again, nearly a century later, by American colonists arguing that King George III had violated their natural rights, justifying revolution and the establishment of a new form of government. But Locke's political philosophy was not merely negative, not merely about limiting government and justifying resistance. He had positive things to say about how legitimate government should be structured. First, government should be divided into separate powers. The legislative power, the authority to make laws, should reside in a representative body, ideally elected by the people or at least by property-owning citizens. This legislature should be supreme, the voice of the people themselves establishing the rules under which society operates. But legislative power should be limited. It cannot be arbitrary. Laws must be general, known in advance, applied equally, to all. The legislature cannot simply take property without consent, cannot rule by decree, cannot delegate its authority to a dictator. It is bound by natural law and by the trust placed in it by the people. Second, there should be an executive power responsible for enforcing laws and conducting foreign policy. This executive should be strong enough to act decisively, but ultimately subordinate to the legislature, since the legislature represents the people more directly. Third, there should be independent judges to settle disputes according to established law. The rule of law, not the rule of men, should govern society. This separation and balancing of powers, this insistence on rule of law, this recognition that government authority is limited and conditional, these ideas would deeply influence the architects of the American Constitution. When James Madison designed a system of checks and balances, when Thomas Jefferson wrote that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed, when the Declaration of Independence asserted the right of revolution against tyranny, they were walking paths John Locke had blazed. But perhaps most revolutionary was Locke's argument for religious toleration. In an age when religious uniformity was enforced by law, when dissenters faced persecution, when wars were fought over questions of faith, Locke argued that government had no business dictating religious belief. Why? Because belief cannot be compelled. The mind cannot be forced to accept something as true merely because government commands it. Faith, if it is genuine, must be free. A coerced belief is no belief at all, merely an external conformity masking inner dissent. Moreover, the purpose of government is to protect life, liberty, and property in this world. The salvation of souls is not within its jurisdiction. Church and state have different domains and different means. The church operates through persuasion and teaching. The state operates through law and force. To mix these is to corrupt both. Therefore, Locke argued, civil authority should tolerate diverse religious beliefs. Let Catholics and Protestants, Anglicans and dissenters, Christians and Jews all worship according to their conscience, so long as they do not threaten civil peace. The state should enforce laws against theft and murder, not laws against heresy. Locke's toleration had limits. He excluded atheists on the grounds that they could not be trusted to keep oaths, and Catholics on the political grounds that they owed allegiance to a foreign power, the Pope. These exclusions seem narrow and inconsistent today, but in Locke's context, even this limited toleration was radical. And the logic of his argument pointed toward ever greater inclusivity, even if Locke himself did not fully embrace that logic. The implications of Locke's political philosophy ripple forward through centuries. They made possible the democratic revolutions that transformed the Western world. They established principles that are now considered foundational to free societies: government by consent, rule of law, protection of individual rights, separation of church and state, the right of revolution against tyranny. But they also contained tensions and contradictions that would take generations to work out, and which we are still navigating today. Locke spoke of universal human equality, but accepted slavery under certain conditions. He argued for natural rights belonging to all human beings, but practically excluded women from political participation. He defended property rights, but owned shares in colonial enterprises that dispossessed indigenous peoples. The gap between his universal principles and his particular prejudices reveals the human limitations even of great thinkers. Yet the principles themselves, once articulated, have a logic that pushes beyond the limitations of their author. If all human beings possess natural rights to life, liberty, and property by virtue of being human, then this must include enslaved Africans, indigenous Americans, women, the poor, everyone. Later thinkers would deploy Lockean arguments to expand the circle of rights, to challenge slavery, to demand women's suffrage, to fight for civil rights. The architecture Locke built could house more than he perhaps intended. Now, let us return to Locke's epistemology, his theory of knowledge, because there is more depth here than we have yet explored. For Locke was not content simply to say all knowledge comes from experience. He wanted to understand the nature of knowledge itself, its limits and possibilities, with careful precision. Locke distinguished between different kinds of ideas based on their relationship to the world. Some ideas, he argued, genuinely resemble qualities in objects themselves. Others are merely the mind's response to certain physical configurations, not resembling anything in the external world. He called the first kind primary qualities. These include solidity, extension, figure, motion, and number. A ball is genuinely round, genuinely in motion, genuinely possesses a certain size and mass. These qualities belong to the object itself and would exist even if no mind perceived them. But then there are secondary qualities: color, taste, smell, sound, warmth. These, Locke argued, do not really exist in objects themselves in the way they appear to us. Color is not in the rose, but is the effect the rose's physical structure has on our visual system. Sweetness is not in the honey, but is the sensation honey produces in our taste organs. The warmth you feel is not in the fire itself, which is merely rapidly moving particles, but is the effect of those particles on your nervous system. This distinction might seem technical, but it has profound implications. It means the world as it exists independently of perception is quite different from the world as we experience it. The universe of pure physics, Locke suggested, is colorless, soundless, odorless, a realm of particles in motion with various sizes, shapes, and speeds. All the richness of sensory experience, the redness of red, the sweetness of sweet, the warmth of warmth, these are contributions of the perceiving mind. Does this make secondary qualities less real? Not exactly. They are real experiences, real qualities of our perceptual states. But they do not resemble anything in the external world in the way primary qualities do. And this means that our experience, while caused by the external world, is not a perfect mirror of it. This leads to a sobering recognition of the limits of human knowledge. We can know that external objects exist and affect us. We can know their primary qualities through careful observation and measurement. But our access to the ultimate nature of things, to the real essences of substances, is severely limited. Locke distinguished between nominal essences and real essences. The nominal essence of something is the set of observable properties by which we classify it. The nominal essence of gold, for example, might be yellowish metal, heavy, malleable, doesn't rust. These are the properties we use to identify gold and distinguish it from other substances. But the real essence of gold, its ultimate constitution, the internal structure that explains why it has these observable properties, this we do not know. We can study gold carefully, measure its properties precisely, even uncover some aspects of its internal structure with advanced instruments. But Locke believed there would always be a gap between our classificatory schemes and the true essences of things. This epistemological humility was characteristic of Locke. He insisted that we acknowledge the limits of human understanding rather than pretending to certainty we do not possess, and he suggested we should be content with the degree of knowledge we can attain, which, while imperfect, is sufficient for the practical purposes of human life. Locke distinguished 3 degrees of knowledge, ranked by their certainty. The highest is intuitive knowledge, where we perceive the agreement or disagreement between ideas immediately, without need for proof, that you exist, that a circle is not a square, that 3 is more than 2. These you know intuitively, directly, certainly. The second degree is demonstrative knowledge, where we perceive the agreement or disagreement between ideas through intermediate steps of reasoning. Mathematical proofs exemplify this. We do not see immediately that the angles of a triangle equal 2 right angles, but we can demonstrate it through a series of steps, each of which is intuitively certain. The third and lowest degree is sensitive knowledge, knowledge of the existence of particular external objects. That this flower exists here and now, that this sound is occurring, we know through sensation. But this knowledge lacks the complete certainty of intuition or demonstration. We might be deceived by dreams or hallucinations. Still, the evidence is strong enough for practical purposes. We can be reasonably certain of the existence of objects we currently perceive. What about everything else, the vast realm of beliefs about things we do not currently perceive or cannot demonstrate? Here Locke introduced the concept of probability. Most of our beliefs are not knowledge in the strict sense, but probable judgments based on evidence. The sun will rise tomorrow. Paris is the capital of France. Bread nourishes. These are highly probable beliefs, but they lack the absolute certainty of intuition or demonstration. This means we should proportion our assent to the evidence. Where evidence is strong, believe strongly. Where evidence is weak, believe tentatively, and be willing to revise beliefs when new evidence emerges. This scientific attitude, this intellectual humility, combined with confidence in reason and observation, was central to Locke's vision of human knowledge. Locke also devoted considerable attention to language, recognizing that words are essential to thought, but also a frequent source of confusion and error. Words, he argued, stand for ideas in the mind of the person using them. Communication works when my words call up in your mind ideas similar to those in mine. But this process is imperfect. Words can be vague, ambiguous, used inconsistently. Much of human disagreement, Locke thought, stems from linguistic confusion rather than genuine differences of opinion. People use the same words to mean different things, or different words to mean the same thing, and waste time in fruitless debate. If we would only define our terms clearly, many disputes would dissolve. This concern with language led Locke to offer recommendations for clear thinking and communication. Define your terms explicitly. Use words consistently. Distinguish between different senses of the same word. Don't assume others mean by a word exactly what you mean. These may seem like common sense, but Locke observed that people violate these principles constantly, leading to endless confusion. As you settle deeper into rest, consider how Locke's epistemology offers a kind of peace. We need not pretend to certainty we do not possess. We need not claim knowledge of ultimate essences or absolute truths beyond our grasp. It is enough to observe carefully, reason honestly, proportion belief to evidence, and remain open to correction. This is intellectual humility, but it is also intellectual confidence. Confidence that this modest empirical approach can yield genuine knowledge, sufficient for human flourishing. And Locke's own life exemplified this balance of humility and confidence. He had worked as a physician, carefully observing symptoms, trying treatments, noting what worked and what did not, never pretending to complete understanding of the body's mysteries, but accumulating practical knowledge that could heal. He had studied politics, watching governments rise and fall, noting the patterns of tyranny and the conditions of stability, never claiming to know the perfect system, but articulating principles that could guide toward justice. He had examined his own consciousness, noting the flow of sensations and thoughts, the operations of memory and association, never pretending to fathom the ultimate mystery of awareness, but describing accurately what could be observed. This empirical attitude, this willingness to learn from experience while acknowledging the limits of knowledge, was not merely an intellectual position. It was a way of life, a stance toward the world characterized by curiosity, patience, and honesty, and it connected directly to his practical philosophy, his thoughts about how we should live, individually and collectively. Because if the mind is shaped by experience, then we bear responsibility for the experiences we provide to ourselves and especially to the next generation. Locke wrote extensively about education, and his recommendations flow naturally from his epistemological principles. If the mind at birth is a blank slate, then education is literally everything. The child becomes what the child experiences. This is an awesome responsibility for parents and teachers. But Locke's educational philosophy was surprisingly humane and progressive for his time. He opposed the harsh physical discipline common in schools, arguing that beating children teaches them only fear and resentment. He recommended gentle guidance, the formation of good habits through positive example, the cultivation of reason rather than mere obedience. Play is important, he argued, because children learn through activity. Curiosity should be encouraged, not stifled. Education should be adapted to the child's individual temperament and abilities, not forced into a rigid mold. The goal is to form character, to develop judgment and self-discipline, to prepare the child for the responsibilities of adult life in a free society. Locke also emphasized physical education and health. A sound mind in a sound body, he believed. Children should spend time outdoors, should develop physical skills and stamina, should learn to endure some discomfort without complaint. But this toughening should be balanced with genuine care and affection, and education should be practical as well as theoretical. Learn useful skills. Study the world around you. Don't just memorize ancient texts. Observe nature directly. This emphasis on practical, experiential learning would influence educational reformers for centuries. Locke's economic thought also reflected his broader philosophical commitments. He was an advocate of what we might call economic liberalism, though that term would come later. He believed in the right to private property, as we have seen, grounded in the labor theory of value. He defended commercial activity and criticized those who viewed trade as morally suspect. But he also recognized that economic systems could be just or unjust. Property rights were important, but not absolute. The Lockean proviso, enough and as good left for others, imposed moral constraints on appropriation, and government had legitimate roles in the economy, providing infrastructure, coining money, enforcing contracts, preventing fraud. Locke served for several years on the Board of Trade in England, advising the government on economic policy. He wrote about monetary policy, interest rates, the relationship between trade and national prosperity. His approach was empirical, based on observation of how economies actually functioned rather than abstract theorizing. In all of this, we see the consistent application of Lockean principles. Freedom is valuable, both political and economic. But freedom exists within a framework of natural law, natural rights, and mutual obligation. The individual is important but not isolated. We are separate persons with our own rights, but we are also social beings who flourish only in community with others. Locke's relationship with religion is complex and fascinating, revealing both the depth of his faith and his willingness to subject even religious matters to rational scrutiny. He lived in an age when religious questions were literally matters of life and death, when people were executed for heresy, when nations went to war over theological disputes. Yet Locke sought a middle path between religious fanaticism and irreligious skepticism. He wrote a book titled The Reasonableness of Christianity, arguing that Christian faith was compatible with reason, indeed supported by it. The essential doctrines of Christianity, he claimed, were few and simple. Believe that Jesus is the Messiah. Live a moral life according to his teachings. The elaborate theological systems, the fine distinctions of doctrine, the complicated ceremonies, these were human additions, not part of the original simple message. This was a radical simplification, stripping away much that Catholic and Protestant churches considered essential. And it provoked criticism from Orthodox believers who saw Locke as dangerously heterodox, perhaps a secret Unitarian or Socinian, denying traditional doctrines of the Trinity and original sin. Locke also argued that reason could establish certain religious truths, that God exists could be demonstrated through rational argument. The order and design evident in nature pointed to an intelligent creator. Our own existence, our capacity for reason, suggested a rational source. These were proofs, Locke believed, available to anyone who thought carefully, regardless of scriptural revelation. But reason had limits. It could prove God exists, but could not reveal God's specific plans or purposes for humanity. It could establish moral law in general terms, but needed revelation to know the fullness of divine mercy and judgment. So faith and reason complemented each other. Reason established foundations, revelation built upon them. Most importantly for Locke, religious truth could not be imposed by force. Belief was a matter of inner conviction, not external conformity. The state had no right to dictate religious belief, only to maintain civil peace. And different religious communities should tolerate one another, recognizing that sincere people could interpret Scripture differently, that God alone knew human hearts, that compulsion produced only hypocrisy, never genuine faith. This toleration, argument as we have seen, had limits Locke himself placed on it. But the logic pointed toward ever greater inclusivity, and it helped establish a framework for peaceful religious pluralism that has become essential to modern liberal democracies. Locke's own spiritual life seems to have been serious and sincere, if unconventional by the standards of his time. He read Scripture carefully, took theology seriously, believed in providence and divine judgment. But he rejected claims to special revelation, miracles reported by others, any truth that contradicted reason. His religion was rational, moral, and intensely personal rather than institutional. As sleep draws nearer, consider this aspect of Locke's legacy. He showed that you could question authority, including religious authority, while maintaining faith. You could subject beliefs to rational scrutiny without abandoning the search for meaning and transcendence. You could live in a world of natural law without losing wonder at the mystery of existence. The last years of Locke's life bring our story full circle. After decades of danger, exile, and uncertainty, he finally saw his major works published and acknowledged. The essay concerning human understanding, the two treatises on government, the letter concerning toleration, all appeared in print, some anonymously, others with his name attached. He became a respected figure, sought out by younger thinkers, consulted by government officials. He lived quietly with friends, continuing to read and write despite declining health. He corresponded with Newton about philosophy and theology. He advised on economic policy. He watched as the political principles he had defended became reality in England's constitutional monarchy. But he never sought fame or power for themselves. His goal had always been truth, understanding, the careful examination of human nature and human institutions in hopes of making life better, freer, more reasonable. He had risked everything for these ideals, and he had lived to see them gain a foothold in the world. When Locke died in 1704, at the age of 72, he left behind a body of work that would shape the modern world. But he also left questions, tensions, incompleteness. His philosophy was not a finished system, but a beginning, an opening of pathways that others would walk. And they came, those others, building on Locke's foundations, criticizing his assumptions, developing his insights, pushing his principles to conclusions he had not reached. The Irish philosopher George Berkeley, a generation younger, accepted Locke's empiricism, but pushed it toward idealism. If we only know our ideas, never things themselves, perhaps only ideas exist. Matter itself might be a fiction. All that exists is minds and the ideas they perceive. This was not what Locke intended, but it showed the power and the danger of the empiricist approach. Push it far enough, and you might end up doubting the external world entirely. David Hume, the great Scottish skeptic, took Locke's empiricism even further. He questioned whether we could know anything about substance, about causation, about the self. All we ever encounter, Hume argued, are impressions and ideas. We never experience substance, only bundles of qualities. We never experience causal, necessity, only constant conjunction. We never experience a unified self, only a stream of perceptions. Locke had been too conservative, too willing to assume things beyond experience. These critiques revealed both the fertility and the fragility of Locke's philosophy. The blank slate, the empiricism, the focus on experience, all of this was enormously influential. But it raised questions Locke had not fully answered. If all knowledge comes from experience, what guarantees the uniformity of nature? What justifies induction? What gives us knowledge of the external world? What holds the self together as a unity rather than a mere succession of disconnected experiences? Immanuel Kant, the great German philosopher, would attempt a synthesis, accepting the empiricist insight that knowledge begins with experience, while arguing that the mind brings certain structures to experience, organizing it according to innate categories and forms of intuition. Kant claimed to be reconciling empiricism and rationalism, though neither camp was entirely satisfied. In the political realm, Locke's influence was more straightforward and more profound. The American founding fathers absorbed Lockean principles through their pores. Jefferson called Locke one of the three greatest men who ever lived. The Declaration of Independence echoes Locke's language and arguments. The Constitution implements Lockean principles of limited government, separation of powers, protection of rights. The French revolutionaries also invoked Lockean ideas, though with less success at implementation. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen proclaimed natural rights, popular sovereignty, equality before law, all Lockean themes. Throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, movements for democracy, civil rights, decolonization all drew on Lockean arguments. The language of natural rights, human rights, inalienable rights, all stems from the tradition Locke helped establish. But Locke's legacy also includes darker elements. His labor theory of property was used to justify colonial dispossession of indigenous peoples. If they had not mixed their labor with the land in ways European observers recognized, then perhaps the land was still in a state of nature, available for appropriation. This was a perversion of Locke's proviso about leaving enough and as good, but it shows how philosophical arguments can be weaponized. Similarly, Locke's acceptance of slavery under certain conditions, his investment in the slave trade, his failure to extend his principles fully to women and non-Europeans, all reveal the gap between universal principles and particular prejudices. Modern readers approaching Locke face a challenge. We must take seriously both the liberating power of his best insights and the limitations of his worst blind spots. We can honor the principles of natural rights and human equality while recognizing that Locke himself applied these principles incompletely. The architecture he built can house more than he intended if we are willing to finish the construction. In epistemology, Locke's influence continues in psychology, cognitive science, and educational theory. The idea that the mind is shaped by experience, that nature and nurture both matter, that learning happens through engagement with the environment, all reflect Lockean insights, even if modern understanding is more nuanced than the blank slate. Metaphor suggests, we now know that human infants are not quite blank slates. They have innate capacities, predispositions, even some core knowledge. Language acquisition, for instance, seems to depend on innate structures. Moral intuitions appear very early, but experience still plays an enormous role in shaping these capacities, filling them with specific content, developing them in particular directions. The debate between nativism and empiricism continues, but in a more sophisticated form than Locke could have anticipated. In political philosophy, Lockean liberalism remains a powerful tradition, though contested from multiple directions. Some argue it is too individualistic, neglecting community and solidarity. Others say it is not individualistic enough, that Locke's acceptance of majority rule threatens minority rights. Feminists point out its historical exclusion of women. Marxists criticize its defense of private property. Communitarians question its social contract framework. Yet Lockean principles continue to animate debates about justice, rights, democracy, tolerance. When we argue about the proper role of government, the limits of state power, the protection of individual liberty, the legitimacy of revolution, We are arguing within a framework Locke helped create. Perhaps most enduringly, Locke gave us a way of thinking about ourselves that combines empirical honesty with respect for human dignity. We are not finished products, not fixed essences, not predetermined by nature or fate. We are ongoing constructions, built from experience, shaped by choices, capable of change. This is simultaneously humbling and empowering. Humbling because it denies us any claim to innate superiority. Empowering because it suggests we can become better than we are. As consciousness dims, as the boundary between waking and sleep blurs, return for a moment to that question we began with. Who are you? Now you have a Lockean answer. You are a consciousness, a continuity of awareness bound together by memory, experiencing the world through sensation and reflection, building ideas from the materials of experience, constructing an identity through the accumulation of perceptions and thoughts across time. When you sleep tonight, this consciousness will pause, at least in its explicit self-awareness. Dreamless sleep may interrupt the stream. Dreams may present fragments, associations, memories recombined in strange ways. But when you wake, memory will restore continuity. You will recognize yourself. The narrative will resume. The blank slate will have new experiences written upon it. And in this daily rhythm of consciousness and sleep, waking and dreaming, experience and reflection, you participate in the mystery Locke described but could not fully explain. The mystery of the self. That strange unity of awareness that can say I and know itself across the changes of time. Locke's epistemology and his political philosophy come together here in a vision of human existence as fundamentally open to new experiences that can change us, open to new ideas that can reshape our understanding, open to new social arrangements that can better secure our rights and promote our flourishing. The blank slate is not a finished portrait but an invitation. Each day offers new experiences, new thoughts, new possibilities for growth. We are not trapped by innate natures or predetermined essences. We are free within the limits of our circumstances to shape ourselves, to choose what values we will embrace, what kind of people we will become, what kind of society we will build. This freedom is both exhilarating and terrifying. Exhilarating because it means genuine choice, genuine responsibility, genuine possibility for improvement. Terrifying because it means we cannot blame our faults on immutable nature or divine decree. We are, in large measure, authors of ourselves. But we are not solitary authors. We exist in community with others, also free, also self-creating. And this creates both the need for political order and the possibility of genuine community. The social contract is not merely a limitation on freedom, but an expression of it, a mutual recognition of rights, a cooperative effort to build conditions in which all can flourish. Locke understood that humans are neither pure angels nor mere beasts. We are rational creatures capable of recognizing moral law, yet also passionate creatures capable of selfishness and cruelty. We are independent beings, with our own rights, yet also social beings who need others to survive and thrive. The challenge is to create institutions that channel our better nature while checking our worse impulses. This requires education, forming character and habits from childhood. It requires law, establishing clear rules and impartial enforcement. It requires culture, shared values and expectations that shape behavior beyond what law can reach. It requires vigilance, constant attention to whether institutions are serving their proper purposes or drifting toward tyranny. And it requires humility, recognition that we do not have all the answers, that our understanding is partial, that we must be willing to learn from experience and revise our beliefs when evidence demands it. This intellectual humility, this openness to revision, is perhaps Locke's most valuable legacy. In an age of dogmatism, he insisted on questioning. An age of absolute claims, he acknowledged limits. In an age of violent certainty, he counseled tolerance. Not because all beliefs are equally true, Locke was no relativist, but because we are fallible, our knowledge is imperfect, and the path to truth requires freedom to inquire, to debate, to test ideas against experience. As you drift now toward sleep, carry with you this Lockean wisdom. Your identity is not fixed but evolving, shaped by every experience, every choice, every moment of consciousness. Your knowledge, while real, is partial, built from the limited perspective of your particular experience, always open to expansion and correction. Your freedom is real but not unlimited, existing within a framework of natural law and social contract, respected by others to the degree you respect theirs. Tomorrow, you will wake as yourself, consciousness restored, memories intact, ready to receive new experiences that will continue to write upon the slate of your mind. You will face choices about what kind of person you want to become, what values you want to embrace, how you will use your freedom. You will participate in communities that shape you even as you shape them. You will contribute to the ongoing construction of a world in which rights are respected, reason is valued, and humans can flourish. All of this is part of the architecture of the self that Locke helped us understand. Not a finished building, but an ongoing construction. Not a static essence, but a dynamic process. Not a predetermined fate, but an open future. In the blank slate, Locke saw not emptiness, but potential. In experience, he saw not limitation, but opportunity. In consciousness, he saw not a substantial thing, but an active awareness, building itself through engagement with the world. In political order, he saw not oppression, but the possibility of genuine freedom secured through mutual agreement. These insights transformed the world. They made possible new forms of government, new understandings of education, new approaches to knowledge. They challenged inherited privilege and defended individual rights. They promoted tolerance and limited power. They elevated reason without dismissing faith. They honored both individual and community. The questions Locke asked remain our questions. How do we know what we know? What makes us who we are? What legitimizes authority? How much freedom should we have? What do we owe to others? How should children be raised? When is resistance to government justified? We may answer these questions differently than Locke did, informed by 3 more centuries of experience, enlightened about our own era's blind spots in ways Locke could not be about his, but we answer them within a framework of inquiry he helped establish, using methods he pioneered, honoring principles he articulated. The architecture of the self that Locke described is your architecture. The blank slate he hypothesized is, in some measure, your slate, written upon daily by sensation and reflection. The consciousness he analyzed is your consciousness, experiencing these very thoughts at this very moment, creating continuity across time through the binding power of memory. The natural rights he defended are your rights, inherent to your humanity, not granted by government, but protected by it. The social contract he envisioned is the implicit agreement under which you live with others, mutual recognition of freedom within law. As consciousness fades, as sleep claims you gently, the self pauses, but does not disappear. Tomorrow it will resume, refreshed, ready to receive new impressions, to build new ideas, to make new choices. The ongoing construction continues. The narrative unfolds. The blank slate receives new writing. And in this daily rhythm of consciousness and rest, experience and reflection, freedom and order, you live out the philosophical insights John Locke articulated 3 centuries ago. The architecture he described is the architecture of your own being. The questions he asked are the questions of your own existence. The principles he defended are the principles that make your flourishing possible. Rest now in the knowledge that you are free to become, free to choose, free to grow. That your identity is real, but not rigid, continuous but not static, yours but not isolated. That your consciousness will return tomorrow, carrying forward, creating the thread that binds your life into a meaningful whole. The blank slate awaits new experiences. The self awaits new developments. The story continues, as it has from your first moment of awareness to this present instant, as it will tomorrow and beyond. Each experience adding to the accumulation, each choice shaping the person you are becoming, each moment of consciousness participating in the profound mystery of what it means to be human. And with that gentle assurance, with that recognition of your ongoing construction, with that appreciation for the freedom and responsibility of self-creation, let sleep come, let consciousness rest. Let the architecture of the self stand for the night, solid enough to endure, flexible enough to grow, ready to receive tomorrow's experiences and to build from them something new. Like and subscribe for more journeys through the gentle chambers of philosophical thought, where the great minds of history share their wisdom to guide us toward rest and understanding. Until we meet again in the theatre of consciousness, sleep well, knowing you are part of a grand tradition of human reflection on the deepest questions of existence, knowing your freedom is real, your potential is vast, and your story is still being written, one experience at a time, on the blank slate of an ever-developing mind. Before we part, let us linger a moment longer with some of Locke's most intimate insights about the human experience. Those observations about memory, association, habit, and will that reveal not just a philosopher, but a careful student of his own consciousness. Locke noticed something remarkable about how the mind forms connections. Ideas that occur together in experience tend to become associated in thought. If you are frightened by a dog as a child, the idea of dog becomes linked with the idea of danger. Years later, even though you know rationally that most dogs are harmless, the association persists. Your heart races when a dog approaches, not because you choose this reaction, but because experience has written this connection into your mind. This association of ideas, as Locke called it, operates beneath conscious awareness, shaping our responses, our preferences, our very personalities. A song heard during a happy moment becomes linked with happiness, so hearing it years later brings back that feeling. A place associated with grief carries sadness in its very appearance. The smell of bread baking might carry you back to childhood, to your grandmother's kitchen, to a sense of safety and warmth you had forgotten you possessed. These associations are powerful, and Locke warned they could be both beneficial and harmful. Good associations, formed through positive experiences, create healthy habits and pleasant emotions. But negative associations, especially those formed in childhood when the slate is freshest and impressions sink deepest, can haunt us for life. He told a story to illustrate this. A child, frightened by a foolish servant who connected darkness with tales of goblins and spirits, might develop a lifelong fear of the dark. Not because darkness is truly dangerous, but because the association between darkness and terror was formed so early and so strongly that it cannot be easily erased. The grown adult, knowing intellectually that no goblins lurk in shadows, still feels the childish dread, the racing heart, the irrational fear, because experience wrote this connection when the mind was most receptive. This insight about association had profound implications for education and child rearing. Parents and teachers must be careful about what associations they allow to form. Never frighten a child unnecessarily. Never associate learning with punishment, lest the child come to fear knowledge itself. Never link religion with harshness, lest faith become associated with cruelty rather than love. Instead, create positive associations. Let learning be pleasurable. Let virtue be rewarded. Let the child associate good behavior with parental approval, moral action with happiness, knowledge with power and freedom. These early associations, Locke emphasized, shape character more than any explicit instruction. Tell a child 1,000 times that learning is valuable, but if every encounter with books brings punishment for fidgeting or boredom from poor teaching, the child will associate books with unpleasantness. The association speaks louder than the lecture. This is why habit is so important in Locke's moral psychology. Habits are repeated associations, patterns written so deeply into the mind through repeated experience that they become nearly automatic. The virtuous person is not someone who constantly struggles against temptation through willpower alone. Rather, virtue becomes habitual, a pattern of association where right action feels natural, comfortable, even pleasurable. How do we form good habits? Through repeated practice, starting young. A child who learns to control impulses, to delay gratification, to consider others' feelings through countless small experiences, gradually develops self-discipline as a habit. An adult who repeatedly chooses honesty, even when lying would be easier, gradually finds that honesty becomes second nature, the automatic response, the expected behavior. But Locke also recognized that bad habits, once formed, are difficult to break. This is why early education is so crucial. It is far easier to form good habits from the beginning than to replace bad habits later. The associations written on a fresh slate sink deep. Those written over existing associations must compete with what was written before. Yet Locke was not a complete determinist about habit. He believed in the power of reason and will to reshape even deeply ingrained patterns. An adult who recognizes a harmful association can, through conscious effort and repeated contrary experiences, weaken the old connection and form new ones. It is difficult, but possible. The mind that was shaped by experience can be reshaped by new experience, guided by rational reflection. This brings us to Locke's thoughts about freedom and the will, a topic he wrestled with at length and revised multiple times in successive editions of his essay. The question, are we free? And if so, what does freedom mean? Locke argued that the question itself is often poorly formed. People ask, is the will free? But this, Locke suggested, is like asking whether sleep is swift or virtue square. It applies a property to a thing that cannot have that property. Will is not the kind of thing that can be free or unfree. The will is simply the power to choose, to direct action toward or away from something based on desire or aversion. The real question is, are persons free? And here, Locke's answer was nuanced. A person is free when they can do what they will to do, when their actions follow from their choices without external compulsion or internal incapacity. If you want to raise your arm, and you can raise your arm, you are free in that respect. If you want to raise your arm but cannot because someone holds it down, you are not free. If you want to raise your arm but cannot because of paralysis, you are not free. But what about the will itself? Are we free to will what we will? Can we choose our choices? Here, Locke's answer becomes more complex. We do not, he argued directly, choose what we desire. Desires arise from our nature, our experiences, our associations, our current state. You do not decide to be hungry. Hunger arises. You do not choose to desire happiness. You simply do desire it by your nature as a conscious being. What we can choose is which desires to act upon. The will is the power to direct action based on desire. And crucially, we have the ability to suspend action, to pause before acting on a desire, to deliberate, to consider whether satisfying this desire will truly lead to happiness, or whether it might lead to greater pain. This power of suspension, this ability to step back and reflect before acting, is the essence of human freedom for Locke. Animals act on immediate desire. They see food, they are hungry, they eat. But humans can pause. They can ask, is this food good for me? Will eating it now prevent me from enjoying something better later? Does satisfying this appetite align with my long-term goals? This capacity for reflection and deliberation distinguishes human freedom from mere animal behavior. We are not simply driven by desires, but can evaluate desires, can choose which to pursue and which to resist based on rational judgment about what will truly promote our happiness. But Locke recognized a problem. Often we pursue things that do not actually make us happy. We know intellectually that certain pleasures lead to pain, yet we pursue them anyway. Why? Locke's answer involved a careful analysis of how we perceive good and evil, pleasure and pain, present and future. Present goods appear large, vivid, pressing. Future goods appear small, distant, uncertain. A pleasure available now exerts more motivational force than a greater pleasure available tomorrow. This is not because we choose to value the present more. It is how desire naturally operates, shaped by the immediacy of sensation versus the abstraction of imagination. To act rationally, we must correct for this bias. We must make future goods more vivid in imagination, must consider carefully the long-term consequences of present actions, must develop habits that resist immediate gratification in favor of lasting happiness. This requires education, practice, the formation of character through repeated choices that prioritize true good over apparent good. And this is where moral education becomes crucial for Locke. The goal is not to suppress desire, but to train desire, to develop associations between right action and pleasure, between virtue and happiness, so that doing the right thing becomes not a painful sacrifice, but a genuine satisfaction. The virtuous person is not someone who constantly struggles against their nature, but someone whose nature, shaped by experience and habit, inclines naturally toward good. They have formed associations where honesty brings pride, where generosity brings joy, where self-control brings dignity. Virtue is not contrary to happiness, but constitutive of it. As you rest here, consider how these insights apply to your own life. What associations has your experience formed? What habits shape your automatic responses? What desires drive your choices? And crucially, what power do you have to reflect on these patterns, to evaluate whether they truly serve your long-term flourishing, to reshape them through new experiences and conscious effort? Locke's vision is neither completely deterministic nor completely voluntaristic. You are shaped by experience, yes, but you are also a rational agent capable of reflecting on experience, capable of choosing which desires to act upon, capable of forming new habits through deliberate practice. The blank slate has been written upon, but the writing is not indelible. New experiences can overlay old associations. Reflection can guide choice. Will can direct action. This is a liberating and challenging vision. Liberating because it suggests you are not trapped by your past or your nature, that change is possible, that you can become better than you are. Challenging because it places responsibility on you, because it suggests that your character, your happiness, your very self are in significant measure the result of your choices about which desires to pursue, which habits to form, which associations to cultivate. And this personal level of analysis connects back to Locke's political philosophy. Just as individuals must balance freedom with responsibility, desire with reason, present satisfaction with long-term flourishing, so must societies balance individual liberty with social order, personal rights with common good, the freedom to pursue happiness with the constraints necessary for everyone to have that same freedom. The social contract is, in a sense, a collective suspension of immediate desire in favor of long-term good. We agree to limit our natural freedom to do whatever we can get away with, accepting legal constraints and social obligations, because reflection reveals that everyone is better off under such an arrangement than in the insecurity of the state, of nature. But this contract, like individual virtue, must be voluntary to be genuine. Coerced obedience is not true consent, just as forced virtue is not true morality. The legitimacy of government rests on the ongoing consent of the governed, on their continued judgment that this political arrangement serves their genuine interests better than available alternatives. And just as individuals must periodically reflect on their habits and associations, asking whether these truly serve their flourishing, so must citizens periodically reflect on their government, asking whether it truly serves its proper purpose of protecting rights and promoting the common good. When it does not, when government becomes destructive of the ends for which it was established, Locke's theory justifies not just complaint, but resistance, even revolution. This right of revolution has been controversial since Locke first articulated it. Critics worry it invites anarchy, that it gives every discontented faction a justification for violence. But Locke was not counselling revolution lightly. or for trivial causes. He specified that revolution is justified only when there is a long train of abuses, a systematic pattern of rights violations, a clear demonstration that government has abandoned its proper purpose. And he noted that people are naturally conservative, reluctant to overturn established order. Revolution happens not because philosophers write books justifying it, but because governments provoke it through persistent tyranny. The real danger is not that people will rebel too readily, but that they will endure oppression too long, that their habits of obedience and their fear of change will keep them submissive, even when justice demands resistance. This tension between order and liberty, between stability and change, between tradition and reform, runs through all political life. Locke did not resolve it definitively, but he provided principles for navigating it. Respect for natural rights, consent of the governed, rule of law, separation of powers, tolerance of diversity, willingness to reform unjust institutions. These principles have been tested across centuries and found both powerful and imperfect. Powerful because they have inspired movements for freedom, enabled peaceful transfers of power, protected individuals from tyranny, created space for human flourishing. Imperfect because they have been applied selectively, invoked to justify as well as to oppose oppression, interpreted in contradictory ways. The work of building just societies, like the work of forming virtuous character, is never complete. New challenges arise, old solutions prove inadequate, principles must be reinterpreted. For changed circumstances, the blank slate of each new generation must be written upon with the accumulated wisdom of the past, while remaining open to the new insights of the present. Locke himself, despite his profound contributions, had blind spots we now see clearly. His acceptance of slavery, his limited toleration, his assumptions about property and gender, all reflect the prejudices of his time. Later generations have had to extend his principles beyond where he took them, to include those he excluded, to recognize rights he did not acknowledge, to build the more complete and consistent liberalism his own logic implied, but his own practice failed to achieve. This is not a failure of Locke's philosophy, but rather evidence of its power. The principles are strong enough to be turned against their author's own inconsistencies. The logic of natural rights, once unleashed, pushes toward ever greater inclusivity. The commitment to reason and experience demands ongoing refinement of theory in light of observation. The emphasis on consent requires listening to voices previously silenced. In this way, Locke's philosophy is alive, growing, developing, not a dead monument, but a living tradition. Each generation writes its own experiences on the collective slate, forming new associations, developing new habits, creating new institutions, always building on what came before, while also revising, correcting, expanding. And you, lying here, on the threshold of sleep, are part of this ongoing story. The experiences you have, the choices you make, the character you form, the society you help create, all of these contribute to the great human project of building a world where freedom and order, rights and responsibilities, individual flourishing and common good can coexist and reinforce each other. This is Locke's legacy, not a finished system but a method, not dogma but questions, not certainty but the humble confidence that reason and experience, carefully applied, can guide us toward truth and justice, even if we never reach perfect understanding or perfect society. As consciousness dims and sleep approaches, let these thoughts settle gently. You are a self in process, shaped by experience yet capable of reshaping yourself. You are free within limits, able to choose yet influenced by associations and habits. You are an individual with rights, yet also a member of communities with obligations. You are rational yet also passionate, capable of wisdom yet prone to error, finite yet oriented toward transcendent goods. This is the human condition, as Locke understood it, neither angel nor beast, but something between. A rational animal, a political creature, a self-creating consciousness, an embodied soul, a bearer of rights and responsibilities, a blank slate being written upon by experience, even as you use reason, to guide which experiences you seek and how you interpret them. In sleep, this active process pauses, consciousness retreats, explicit self-awareness fades, the will relaxes its direction of attention. But the underlying continuity persists. The memories remain, ready to be accessed when consciousness returns. The habits endure, ready to shape tomorrow's choices. The associations sleep in the depths of mind, ready to influence perception and emotion when you wake. And in dreams, perhaps, the mind continues its work of association and reflection in different mode, freed from the constraints of waking logic, combining memories in novel ways, processing experiences, consolidating learning, perhaps even solving problems that baffled conscious deliberation. Locke himself was fascinated by sleep and dreams, seeing in them evidence for his theories about consciousness and identity. In dreamless sleep, consciousness is truly absent, yet we regard the sleeping person as the same individual who went to sleep. Why? Because we expect consciousness to return, because we anticipate that waking memory will bridge the gap, because personal identity consists in the continuity of consciousness across time, not in unbroken moment-to-moment awareness. And in dreams, consciousness is present but altered. We experience sensations, emotions, thoughts, often vivid and compelling. Yet these experiences are not caused by external objects, but by the mind's own activity, recombining memories, activating associations, playing out fears and wishes in symbolic form. Dreams demonstrate the mind's active power, its ability to construct experience from internal materials, even without sensory input from the external world. Some of Locke's successors would push this observation further. If the mind can construct such vivid experiences in dreams from purely internal sources, how do we know waking experience is any different? Perhaps all experience is constructed by the mind, and we never encounter external reality directly. This idealist conclusion, drawn by Berkeley and others, was not what Locke intended, but it shows how his careful observations could lead to unexpected places. For Locke himself, the distinction between waking and dreaming was clear enough in practice. Waking experience has coherence, consistency, regularity that dreams lack. The waking world obeys natural laws, responds to our actions in predictable ways, is shared by multiple observers who report similar perceptions. Dreams are fragmentary, illogical, private, unshared. This practical difference, even if we cannot prove metaphysically that waking experience corresponds to external reality, is sufficient to ground knowledge and guide action. This pragmatic approach, this willingness to acknowledge limits of certainty while still affirming the possibility of knowledge sufficient for human purposes, is characteristic of Locke's entire philosophy. We cannot prove we are not dreaming, cannot demonstrate with absolute certainty that matter exists, cannot be infallible in our judgments, but we can observe carefully, reason honestly, test our beliefs against experience, and build up a body of knowledge reliable enough to navigate the world and live well. This is intellectual modesty combined with practical confidence. We admit our limitations while still trusting our capacities. We acknowledge uncertainty while still making judgments. We remain open to correction while still committing to beliefs. This balance, this refusal of both dogmatic certainty and corrosive skepticism, is perhaps Locke's most valuable methodological contribution, and it applies not just to theoretical knowledge but to practical wisdom, to the art of living. We cannot know with certainty the best way to live, the perfect character to cultivate, the ideal society to build. But we can observe what tends to promote happiness and what tends to produce misery. We can experiment with different approaches, note the results, adjust our behavior accordingly. We can learn from the experience of others, from history, from diverse cultures and ways of life, extracting principles while remaining alert to context and variation. This experimental approach to ethics and politics, this willingness to treat human institutions not as sacred unchangeable structures, but as provisional arrangements subject to evaluation and reform, was radical in Locke's time and remains challenging today. It asks us to hold our convictions, with what one modern philosopher called appropriate tentativeness, to be confident enough to act while remaining humble enough to learn. As the final veils of consciousness draw across awareness, as thought becomes dreamlike and dreamlike thought fades toward the darkness of deep sleep, carry with you this Lockean equanimity. You need not have all answers. You need not possess perfect certainty. You need not be finished becoming who you will be. It is enough to observe carefully, reflect honestly, choose consciously, and remain open to tomorrow's lessons. The self you are is not the self you will always be. The knowledge you possess is not all the knowledge available. The society you inhabit is not the only society possible. All is process, development, potential, possibility. The blank slate receives new writing daily. The architecture of the self rises higher, more complex, more beautiful, with each experience thoughtfully integrated, each choice consciously made, each habit deliberately cultivated. And in this process, you participate in something larger than yourself, the great human project of understanding and improvement that has continued across millennia and will continue long after you. Locke is one voice in this conversation, an important voice, a clarifying voice, but one among many. Others came before, building the foundations on which he stood. Others came after, developing his insights and correcting his errors. And still others will come, writing new chapters in the ongoing story of human self-understanding and self-creation. Your contribution to this story may seem small, private, insignificant. You are one person among billions, one consciousness among multitudes, one slate among countless others being written upon by experience. But Locke's philosophy suggests that each person matters, each consciousness is valuable, each bearer of natural rights has inherent dignity regardless of station or circumstance. In the leveling egalitarianism of the blank slate, in the universal accessibility of reason and experience, in the shared possession of natural rights, Locke found grounds for human equality that did not depend on pretending we are all the same or all equally developed. We are different in countless ways, shaped by different experiences, forming different associations, developing different characters. But we all began as blank slates. We all build knowledge from experience. We all possess the capacity for reason and reflection. We all have rights inherent to our humanity. We are all ends in ourselves, not merely means to others' purposes. This recognition of equal dignity combined with acknowledgement of actual differences remains politically and personally challenging. How do we honor both? How do we protect equal rights while also recognizing that people have different needs, different capacities, different contributions? How do we balance individual liberty with social responsibility? How do we preserve diversity while also maintaining shared commitments? Locke's answers to these questions were incomplete, as he acknowledged. He offered principles and methods rather than detailed blueprints. He trusted that rational people, observing carefully and reasoning honestly, would develop appropriate arrangements for their particular circumstances. What works in one context may not work in another. What serves one generation may need revision for the next. This trust in human reason and human learning, this confidence that we can improve our condition through thought and experiment, this refusal of fatalism and fixed hierarchies, all of this flows from the blank slate empiricism that Locke articulated. If we are shaped by experience, then we can be reshaped by new experience. If knowledge comes from observation, then new observations can yield new knowledge. If governments rest on consent, then they can be reformed when they lose that consent. This is the radical hope at the heart of Locke's philosophy, the conviction that human life can be better, that reason and freedom are real possibilities, that the future is not determined by the past, that each blank slate can be written upon with better experiences leading to better characters, creating better societies. As you finally release consciousness, as sleep claims you fully, let this hope be your last waking thought. Tomorrow brings new experiences, new choices, new opportunities. The slate that is you will receive new writing. The self that is you will continue its construction. The story that is your life will unfold new chapters. And in all of this, you carry forward the great human capacity for rational freedom that Locke so carefully described and so passionately defended. Rest now in this knowledge. Rest in the certainty that you matter, that your experiences are real, that your choices have meaning, that your self is genuine even as it develops. Rest in the freedom to become, the responsibility to choose, the possibility of growth. Rest in the community of rational beings, past and present and future, all engaged in the great work of understanding and improving the human condition. The consciousness that says, I will return tomorrow. Memory will bind the moments into continuity. The self will resume its ongoing construction. But for now, let go. Let sleep do its restorative work. Let dreams play their mysterious role. Let the mind rest from its labors of perception and reflection. And know that when you wake, you will be yourself, changed by sleep, yet continuous with what went before. A blank slate that has been written upon, but never completely filled. A story that continues. A self that evolves. A consciousness that returns from its nightly sojourn, ready to receive new experiences, and to continue the great work of being human. Thank you for joining this exploration of John Locke's philosophy, this journey through the architecture of the self, this meditation on consciousness and freedom, knowledge and rights, experience and identity. If you found peace in these reflections, please consider subscribing to support this channel, helping these gentle philosophical explorations reach others seeking wisdom in the quiet hours. And let me know in the comments where in the world you are resting tonight, adding your voice to this global community of nighttime philosophers. Until we meet again in the theatre of consciousness, until thought returns and reflection resumes, until tomorrow's blank slate awaits tomorrow's experiences, sleep well, knowing you are free, you are valuable, you are becoming, always becoming, moment by moment, experience by experience, choice by choice, in the ongoing adventure of creating yourself and contributing to the great human project of building a world where all can flourish in freedom, dignity, and mutual respect. Good night, fellow travelers. Good night, conscious beings. Good night, bearers of natural rights and rational capacities. Good night, blank slates being written upon by the infinite variety of human experience. May your sleep be deep, your dreams be gentle, and your waking be a joyful return to the precious gift of consciousness that makes you uniquely and wonderfully you. Good night.